Good afternoon. I'm Arun Seraphin, the Deputy Director of the Emerging Technologies Institute at the National Defense Industrial Association, NDIA. Thank you to all the attendees for your support of NDIA and ETI. And thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Understanding Appropriations for Critical Defense Technologies. This is part of our member value series. We hope that this webinar helps you understand the appropriations process through which our Defense Department, industry, university partners are all funded. Some administrative remarks before we get started. First, all attendees' lines are muted. Second, if you have a question during the webinar, you can submit your question in the question box in the webinar panel on the right side of your screen. We will do our best to get through all the questions during the Q&A after the presentation. We're recording today's webinar for NDIA, Women in Defense, and NHTSA and NTSA members unable to attend, and for any member who wishes to review the material at a later date. And last, within the next few days, we'll post the recording, the slides, and the answers to the Q&A to NDIA Connect for your review. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Tara Murphy Dougherty. She's the CEO of Govini. Prior to her role as the CEO, Tara served as Govini's President of National Security, leading strategy and growth and overseeing Govini's work with all federal clients. Tara's held leadership positions in technology across industry, government, and nonprofit sectors, including at Palantir Technologies, and serving as Chief of Staff for Global Strategic Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, amongst other senior roles. Tara holds a BS in Georgia from the Georgia Institute of Technology and an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown. She's also a term member on the Council of Foreign Relations. I've had an opportunity to work with Tara some since I got here to NDIA in the last few months. Tara's got a unique perspective on the challenges of emerging technologies trying to break into the Defense Department, and for new companies trying to break into the Defense Department. Tara is also one of the go-to people in town to understand the constant flow of numbers and data about budgets and contracting, and she's been a great resource for our ETI team so far. So we're really looking forward to this seminar. And with that, I will stop and turn it over to you, Tara. Thanks for your support for us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Arun, and for that great introduction. Certainly, NDIA and Govini have been longtime partners, sharing data and insights, analyses, collaborating on projects such as the Vital Signs Report, and we at Govini are very excited to extend that partnership to ETI and see what we can contribute to together moving forward. I'm going to share my slides. We have a pretty dense and exciting presentation to walk through today, and thought I would just quickly tee up the things that I wanted to cover. So I wanted to touch on why emerging technology is critical to U.S. national security, especially in the context of intensifying strategic competition with China. I then wanted to spend a bit of time on Govini's 2022 National Security Scorecard, which is really exciting and unique this year, but most importantly, as it pertains to this topic, this scorecard analyzes U.S. government spending on critical emerging technologies over the last few years. And then finally, provide a high-level overview of trends in RDT&E spending in the two most recent budget cycles. So we'll focus on fiscal year 2022 enacted and fiscal year 23 in terms of the President's budget request to get a sense of where things may be headed. If we step back for a second and get away from some of the acronyms and the really wonky details I just mentioned, which hopefully your attendees are as excited about as I am, I think the way to sum up what today's session is really going to be about is rhetoric versus reality. And there are a few areas other than R&D for critical emerging technologies in national security where I think that question or that dynamic, the rhetoric versus reality dynamic, is more interesting. So if I jotted down what I thought maybe the question that crystallizes this situation is essentially what we're saying, and with these various analyses are endeavoring to answer, is how can we simultaneously laud historically large or high R&D budgets, while at the same time as the defense community continue to reasonably, I'd argue, lament the lack of innovation and the inability to scale the valley of death. So we're going to look at, again, the strategic context, but then spending realities against budget plans and how congressional appropriations play into that in order to try and answer some of those questions. So let's start with the strategic context. Certainly, emerging technology is changing how people across the world live, how they interact with each other, how nations compete, and how the future of war is going to be waged on the battlefield. I'd argue that what we've seen in Ukraine is a stark demonstration of exactly this dynamic and the tension between emerging capabilities and how they modernize warfare, alongside what remains very traditional and frankly gruesome, unmodern approaches to combat as well. The battle for technological advantage is a central component of everything we're thinking about in strategic competition between the United States and China across global battlefields among all great partners. And it's going to be the defining geopolitical element of rivalry, I'd argue, for decades to come. I've seen some observers or practitioners in this space liken this battle to a new technology Cold War. And unfortunately, many would say that the United States is not currently winning this Cold War. The battle for technology advantage has received significant attention in recent years, both from the press as well as from the government side. In terms of the executive branch, presidential administration priorities, and from the Hill with Congress. All of that attention has led to an absolute proliferation of strategies, policies, priority lists, enacted legislation, pending legislation, contracting pathways, technology incubators, accelerators, all of these initiatives, many of which are incredibly important, designed to improve and drive US federal ability to work with new non-traditional partners, to harness innovation, and to overall improve US or achieve US national security interests as a result of, or in a way that's superior to other methods or attempts if we were to lack that kind of emerging technology. That being said, for all of the activity we see, we don't spend enough time, I'd argue, in this space actually measuring the impact or the outcomes of all of these activities. That's probably the perfect tee-up to what the raison d'etre of Govini's National Security Scorecard is. So as I mentioned, this is an annual product, and this year I'm particularly proud of it. If we are, as a national security community, to start putting the focus on outcomes and on results, we need to use the data to identify what is actually being done, not just look at plans, not just create more activities and initiatives, but look at results, look at outcomes, and look at what is actually taking place. In this year's National Security Scorecard, which is the Critical Technologies Edition, this work analyzes what the US federal government has invested in critical technologies over a 5-year time period, from fiscal 2017 to fiscal year 2021, and which vendors the federal government is relying on or working with in order to bring these technologies to bear across all different phases of the life cycle. I believe this is a truly unique piece of work, and it is something that should start to change that dynamic that I often describe as, if you walk around the Pentagon and you ask someone, what is DoD spending on technology X, they'll quote you a budget number. But that shift from not just looking at plans, but also looking at actual results and what happened has to include a view of spending. So across 11 different critical technology areas, which comprise this scorecard's critical technologies taxonomy, that actual spending and those actual numbers and results, essentially the dollars that went out the door, are summarized here. Let me just walk you through what you're looking at. Again, organized by 11 different areas. These critical technology areas, which are in the orange segments, are the macro level segments that actually are derived from the priority technology list that was released in a February 1st memo by the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. What's important about that is that means that these technology areas represented in the orange segments are not just what Govini believes are important, but they are the technologies that the United States Department of Defense has said are, quote, vital to maintaining the United States national security. So this is it. This is the space that from a critical or emerging tech area, we need to be focused on and looking at and judging the outcomes of, in addition to looking at the inputs too. In the orange segments, you see an overall macro level view of the total spending represented in that dollar amount over this 5-year time period, as well as a compound annual growth rate and an arrow designator indicating whether the growth has increased or decreased over that time period. You can see that for almost all of these technology areas, spending has increased, and there's one that has decreased, and we'll dive into that a little bit later. It is noteworthy. 2 quick notes also on the details or methodology of this. When we talk about spending, what these numbers include means contracts. So FAR contracts, other transaction authorities, and grants. Second, it does include spending by all of the US federal government, not just the Department of Defense or the national security community. It's also worth noting that the critical technologies taxonomy is really a taxonomy of taxonomies, which I'm now realizing may be the most Govini statement I've ever made. But the point is that each technology area is in effect its own taxonomy, with multiple subsegments nesting under that one macro level segment that you saw in orange. This provides an unbelievably granular view of the activities that are actually taking place within DoD, within the US federal government, by agency, by office, with whom across the market from a vendor perspective, and most importantly, on what from a technology perspective. In this slide, we're showing just an example that's highlighted the biotechnology taxonomy and how that nests under this overall taxonomy of critical technologies for the US federal government. Before diving into some of the specific technology areas, let me take a minute to make a note on kind of the overall view here. And so this slide is showing you the macro level trends in terms of spending on 11 different technologies: biotechnology, space technology, computing and user interfaces, artificial intelligence, machine learning and autonomy, advanced communications, hypersonics, microelectronics, renewable energy, directed energy, advanced materials, and additive manufacturing over a 5-year time period comprising fiscal year 2017 to 2021. As you can see from the chart, there were sharp increases in spending levels in both fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 2021, with fiscal year 2021 nearly double what spending was in fiscal year 2017 at the start of this taxonomy. All but one technology area, as I mentioned on the previous slide, experienced positive growth over the time period. The one exception to that is the segment that encompasses space technology, and as I said, we'll dive into that in a little bit of more detail. At a high level, this is a good news story. You know, I mentioned at the outset that we want to look at rhetoric versus reality here, and certainly this looks like the rhetoric is accurate. We talk a lot about driving modernization efforts, investing in emerging technologies across the federal government and national security sector. And if you just look at the overall trend line here, it would say that that is accurate. If you dig a little bit deeper, and we will do that by looking specifically at biotechnology in particular, you will find, as you can see from that nearly doubled green line, a significant jump in overall spending was driven by COVID-19 research, vaccines, and treatments. It's important not because there's anything wrong with the investment during a massive global public health crisis in these COVID-19 treatments and research, quite the opposite. And in fact, I would never argue that public health preparedness and resilience is not a national security issue or imperative in the face of something like COVID-19. What I want to highlight and ask all of you to think about is if you remove from this equation the massive increases we saw on spending in order to combat the pandemic, does that good story hold? Does the trend remain at the level of investment that we as national security professionals know is requisite in order to effectively compete with China? That's the question that we need to answer, and that's the question that we need data in order to assess. From an overview perspective or a high-level analysis of the results, I wanted to also highlight the spending when broken down by who is doing the investments. So this slide demonstrates by technology area spending that is being driven by the Department of the Army, by the Navy, by the Air Force, in the DoD-wide account, or by other US federal agencies. I mentioned before that we've thought it was important in order to do a full comprehensive assessment of federal spending of these technologies. And so let me make clear why we believe that's the case. If we only looked at spending driven by DoD or a national security subset of the interagency that align with national security, such as Department of Homeland Security and the intelligence community, we would really miss out on the important fact that critical technologies are almost entirely fundamentally dual use technologies. And the applicability of many of these emerging technology areas, particularly early in the S&T phase of the RDT&E overall framework, really misses out on the applicability of both sides, both on commercial as well as in the national security sector, or more specifically, applications on the battlefield that might be leveraged from civilian technologies. It also wouldn't take into account the tremendous benefit that can be garnered when you're thinking about the business of the national security enterprise and how many of those systems can be leveraged from civilian efforts or share that dual use aspect in terms of a commercial technology that has applicability for our national security agencies. So we really can't divide the world when we're thinking about critical technologies just down to a subset of agencies. We need to think about it, dare I say, as a whole of government effort. Secondly, given the increasing prominence of cyber attacks, influence operations, information, corporate espionage, civil fusion, and a range of other non-kinetic activities that tie into strategic competition globally, all of that constitutes national security interests. And so we really thought in order to provide an accurate assessment of investments in critical technologies and form the basis of what we evaluate as we look forward into those FY22, FY23 plans and beyond, we really needed to look across the entire space. These maps show two different geographic representation of spending overall tied to this macro level critical technologies taxonomy. The chart on the left shows the headquarters locations of all of the vendors that are providing critical technologies to the federal government. The chart on the right shows the place of performance. This is a particular type of analysis that Govini has done repeatedly for the Department of Defense and various entities who follow this type of information and analysis for almost 5 years now. And I have to tell you, the results in how they've changed are quite dramatic. If you took the same assessment anecdotally and you looked at what that map, particularly on the left in orange, would look like 4 or 5 years ago, it would be very different. And I know that because we did that analysis. The distribution of these headquarter locations across the country that are all feeding into federal activities and efforts is really, really, talk about a good news story. This is fantastic. We know that innovation is happening all over the United States and all over the American economy. And it used to be that the preponderance, the vast majority of any federal activity was still dominated around the national capital region. To be able to look at a taxonomy of 11 different critical technology areas, ranging from biotechnology to satellites you put into space, and see a distribution of companies that are collaborating with the federal government that touch on not just the traditional NCR, but all of the technology hubs of the United States, that's what we're looking for. It might not be sufficient, but certainly we have started to access these areas of innovation that are going to be so important to driving overall effectiveness in the competition that the United States is waging with China. Okay, so that's the overview. This is our opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into some of the specific technology areas. As I mentioned, there are 11 different macro level technology areas with a lot of detail underneath them. I'm going to touch on just a few that I think are the most important, and I am trying to keep an eye on the clock because there's quite a bit of detail here. Since we saw such a significant rise in biotechnology, let's begin there. It's actually the increase in spending on biotechnology over the past 5 years, especially in fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 2021, that drives the overall spending increases in the taxonomy as a whole. You can see that within the biotechnology segment, we've broken the taxonomy down into 4 subsegments and then 2 subsegments each under each of these areas. We'll look at spending, again, over a 5-year time period across population health, precision medical, informatics, and operational. And you can see from the green arrow going up, again, representing a CAGR over a 5-year time period, that spending in each of these 4 segments has increased. This shows you year over year where of those 4 subsegments the spending, how it changed and at what level. And what is notable is that the largest, most dramatic spikes were in the population health segment, which includes the infectious disease subsegment. This is specifically where the spending on COVID-related research can be found. If you look at the top vendors, which is what this chart represents, the top 10 vendors that are on the awarded side of this biotechnology spending, you can see right there evidently within the first 5 how COVID really drove this spike. So the top 5 vendors were all heavily involved in either the development, the production, or the distribution of COVID vaccines and treatments. Again, we recognize that, and you can look at the CAGRs to see just how significant that impact was. We recognize that this played the largest role in that overall increase. And notably, AstraZeneca was one of the top 3 vendors, which really highlights that the overall US federal government COVID response efforts were not simply oriented at combating COVID in the United States, but were truly global in nature. Another interesting aspect of who funded COVID research is highlighted on this slide. So you can see in both fiscal years, 20 and 21, increases in Army spending in particular were roughly as large as the overall increase for the rest of the Department of Defense and the US federal government combined. In other words, it was the Army that was the contracting method for Operation Warp Speed, the body that really took the funding available on the federal side for COVID R&D, for vaccine availability and treatment availability, and made it available across the United States and with our international partners. One last interesting aspect would be COVID-related spending mechanisms. So this chart shows you from an overall spending perspective across the biotechnology segment for the 5-year time period, how those contracts were awarded from a mechanism perspective. The blue-green view is your traditional FAR contracts, orange represents grants, gray represents OTAs or other transaction authorities. Interestingly, and I think poorly understood, OTAs have been around since the late 1950s. They were originally designed to advance American space capabilities, but fundamentally they are about getting commercial agreements in place with federal partners in order to drive needs, whether those needs are R&D, those needs are prototypes, or more recently, those needs are COVID response activities. But certainly OTAs played an important part in this overall response to the pandemic. The second area that I thought I would speak in a bit more detail about is space technology. So this was the one segment where we did not see a steady rise over the time period, which is surprising as you reflect on the creation of the Space Force, NASA's Moon to Mars initiative, the stunning images to be released from the James Webb Telescope. So much has happened in space to put it in the news in the last few years. That in combination with certainly the emphasis that we heard from the previous presidential administration might lead one to think that this is a booming area of investment for the US federal government. But instead, we have not seen the kind of growth that we observed in other areas. And there are some possibilities in terms of some of this data might be classified, and that contributes to slightly lower numbers. But overall, I think the trends hold, and it's an area to watch moving forward in order to see how the resource picture might change. If we look at spending by space tech segments and subsegments, so space technology as a macro level segment is broken down into national security satellites, space science, space missions, launch vehicles, and Earth observation. We see that the primary drivers are drops in spending on communication satellites and, more significantly, in launch vehicles. On communication satellites during this time period, we saw the last planned launch of the Advanced Extremely High Frequency Satellite Program, as well as a significant pause in planned launches for the wideband Global Satcom Satellite Program, and that might contribute to the numbers here. On launch vehicles, the drop could indicate an increasing shift to leveraging commercial space launch, as well as overall decrease in terms of costs passed on to the federal government for the same or similar levels of activities. If you look at the top vendor view for space technology, you see in slots 1 and 2 your traditional major players who are leading space initiatives for the federal government. Notably, you also see SpaceX as well as Blue Origin rise into the top 10, again, reinforcing this potential shift or at least an increase in participation of commercial space players in the federal market. And then this final analytic looks again at place of performance and vendor headquarter location over the time period. And you see that the vast majority of both headquarter locations and contracting activity places of performance really center on or concentrate in the traditional locations you would expect: coastal Florida, Houston, Huntsville, Alabama, Colorado Springs, and Southern California. On the one hand, we all know that if you're going to launch something into space, you want to be as close to the equator as possible. So some of this is expected from a location perspective. There's also an aspect of infrastructure that comes into play with space launch facilities where a startup or a new entrant in the field would make a very wise or reasonable decision to go to a location where that kind of infrastructure could be leveraged or new investments would be required. On the other hand, as you see more companies break into this space and take on different aspects or parts or components or be suppliers to overall space companies or primes on space efforts, it really raises the question as to whether they'll stay concentrated in these areas or disperse more across the geographic region. The final area that I want to spend some time on is artificial intelligence, machine learning, and autonomy. And this is a technology area that's particularly important to Govini as a decision science company. We fundamentally believe that leveraging data at scale, which obviously can only be done through the application of artificial intelligence, will drive not just the future of national security and global competition, but also the future of human activity in our lives more broadly. So let's look at some of these trends. The AI, ML, and autonomy taxonomy breaks down into segments that include data at scale, decision science, computer vision, machine learning, autonomy, and natural language processing. If you look at these numbers and the totality of them, you may see that as we report and define this taxonomy, the overall spending level of the time period is significantly higher than what other assessments of US federal spending on artificial intelligence might be in other places. That's because they're not one-for-one assessments of just AI spending. This taxonomy, and this is where it's important to really blow out the subsegments and look at everything that's included. This taxonomy includes not just a range of different AI ML activities, but importantly, it includes data at scale, accounting for more than 80% of the total spending in this technology area as a whole. There are a variety of places where one could reasonably put data at scale as a category within the overall technology, and we decided to put it here because it's so symbiotic with disciplines such as machine learning, natural language processing, autonomy, and computer vision. Data at scale fundamentally enables the development and functionality of these AI technologies, and at the same time, AI is needed in order to make sense of and actually apply the information and intelligence that's provided by data at scale when done properly. So in terms of trends, over the time period, this category of AI, ML, and autonomy, with the segments that I described in the previous slide broken down, accounts for a growth of more than 50% from FY17 to FY21. So significant increases over the time period for the overall segment. Additionally, every single subsegment within the overall category of AI, ML, and autonomy saw positive growth. The lowest rate of growth within the segment was a 4.6% CAGR, and the highest rate of growth was 25.9%. Really important to highlight a specific example here of how these investments over exactly this time period are already today making an impact on the battlefield. So we know, and you can see this and observe it and learn about it just from what's reported in the press. Artificial intelligence-driven intelligence fusion and processing capabilities, which are a direct outgrowth of investments that DoD has made in AI technologies like computer vision, in leveraging data management platforms in order to feed that intelligence fusion and processing, are now working together in unprecedented ways to provide situational awareness on the battlefield for the Ukraine fight. This is remarkable because this is something that initially was emerging technology, nothing more than RDT&E funding. These were early stage AI efforts in the area of computer vision to take intelligence and fusion, processing, targeting into an entirely new era. And today what we're seeing is that Ukrainian forces are using this intelligence to devastating effects in ways one could argue are changing the character of warfare. At the same time, despite the strong growth in spending on AI, ML, and autonomy by the United States government in recent years, and additionally activity like the creation of the Chief Digital AI Officer, and many other successful examples. We continue to hear about both challenges on bringing other technologies and innovative companies into the defense ecosystem so that more examples like the one I just gave in terms of the intelligence helping in the Ukrainian war can come to bear. As well as, I think we've got to be honest with ourselves and look at what's happening in China. And while it might not be a one-to-one comparison to say, this is what the United States is doing versus what China is doing, and therefore we can directly assess a head-to-head competition. Nor do I have an answer to the age-old force planning question, how much is enough? That aspect of this analysis in terms of determining whether these are the right set of investments at the right level absolutely is the next step to be taken on and done. As we talked about earlier, many of the critical technologies in the overall taxonomy I've highlighted are dual use, and the AI, ML, and autonomy category is a perfect example of exactly that. Whether you're talking about natural language processing applications or you're talking about autonomous vehicles, there is applicability on the commercial side as well as in the national security sector. Interestingly, there is significant spending on the technology area happening outside of DoD in the federal government, and that's what this purple line at the top of the chart represents. This is a really good example of where better understanding within the overall interagency in terms of activities that are happening within DoD and activities that are happening in the civilian agencies, the better those are mutually understood, the more the information is shared and these capabilities are leveraged, the more efficient we'll operate and the more we'll be able to benefit from these emerging technology areas. And finally, for this segment, this map shows the geographic distribution, again, of the vendor headquarters and the places of performance for the AI, ML, and autonomy segment. Again, this demonstrates that the federal government in activities in this area is not just continuing to leverage companies headquartered in the Eastern Corridor, but is really tapping into technology hubs that range all down the West Coast across areas such as Austin, Texas, and others. Okay, final time I'm going to shift gears, and I'll try and wrap this up in 5 minutes so that we have some time for questions. I want to start looking forward now that we've taken stock of where we are or have been over the past 5 years. So in the rhetoric versus reality question, we now have a sense of what actually happened. We can talk about budgets of past. We can talk about what the FY17 FYDP said, but no matter what the plans were, we now have a data-driven view of exactly what actually took place in those areas of critical technologies. So now let's look at, on that basis, what is the next set of plans moving forward, both taking stock of where we are in FY22 and then a high-level look at FY23. An important caveat, and I think this is an important aspect of using data in order to uncover these trends and do these kinds of assessments. Despite the framing of rhetoric versus reality, looking at spending and then looking at an RDT&E budget is not a one-to-one or apples-to-apples comparison. They are not the same thing. The critical technologies taxonomy looks at spending specifically, by technology area that are defined in certain areas across a wide range of spending mechanisms, but that's not defined the same way that the RDT&E budget is defined, which is a different portfolio definition. It's also unique to DoD, and in fact, even the White House doesn't define R&D spending the way that DoD defines the RDT&E budget. So it's very complex in terms of what you're looking at by technology area across things like federal R&D spending, which is one set of activities, the Department of Defense RDT&E budget, which is another set of activities, and then the Govini Critical Technologies Taxonomy, which is a third and different set of activities. So I just want to be clear that the trends are meaningful and the overall picture provides a really solid basis for comparison, but not in a detailed one-to-one way. And then secondly, just keep in mind that the taxonomy of spending that we just talked about is looking at federal-wide spending, so all US agencies. And this budget look is going to take a look just at DoD only, both in terms of the President's budget request as well as the FY23 budget request, as well as the fiscal year 2022 appropriation. Okay, so fiscal year 2022, speaking of, was a very unique year. And this is where we really start to hear about big increases in RDT&E funding levels. So the Biden administration requested $113.6 billion for RDT&E in fiscal year 2022, which was a $3 billion increase over the enacted levels of FY21. This was not surprising, but a lot of chaos was involved in the overall process. There was a long-term continuing resolution that pushed the defense appropriation into the spring, and then Russia invaded Ukraine and everything changed. Instead of having a head-to-head stalemate on getting any defense appropriation through at all, Congress swiftly took action and actually gave DoD more money than was in the president's budget request, and passed a defense budget with a top line that was significantly higher than what the administration had originally asked for. RDT&E funding levels, like everything in the defense budget, also benefited from this plus up and was enacted at higher than nearly more than $10 billion above what was requested. You can see this summarized in the requested and enacted chart on the left, or bars that are to the left of that cut line. And then to the right of the line, we can take a look at what was requested in the 2023 President's budget request. It seems to be a continuation of the overall story, with a total PBR around $130 billion for RDT&E. I believe it's 130.1, so I'm rounding here with these big numbers. And that's still about $10 billion more than what was enacted in fiscal year 2022. It remains to be seen what Congress will enact, but so far early indications are that there's a good chance that appropriations will give the Department of Defense more money than was requested. There's a bit of a discrepancy between the House and the Senate, but when it comes on the appropriation side, but when it comes to what we're seeing in the NDAA out of the authorizing committees on both the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee, we're seeing that they're moving in a direction of going higher than the administration request as well. So then if that's the case and everything seems to be going up, then the question becomes, are these increases in the RDT&E budget real, or is simply everything going up? And as the saying goes, it's a case of the rising tide lifting all boats. There has been, as I mentioned at the very outset of this conversation, a tremendous amount of focus on historically large R&D budgets for the Department of Defense. While that may be the case, do we see a notably different movement to shift emphasis into R&D or into RDT&E spending, or are we simply seeing a set of overall numbers that continue to get larger and larger? So this is the last detailed chart I'll get into, because in addition to looking at the overall spending on that we mentioned on the previous slide, and the portion of RDT&E, the portion of the overall budget that RDT&E comprises, the second way to evaluate RDT&E spending, or the increases in the dynamic that we're talking about, is to look at how that spending breaks down shouldn't say spending, I'm conflating what we just talked about, how the investment, we're talking budget plans, break down across budget activity. So if you think about 6.1, 6.2, and 6.3 budget activities as the S&T portfolio within our DT&E, then you see an increase in from FY22 to be higher in the enacted than the request, but then you see a drop in the FY23 request to 18.3 billion, which is an increase over what the administration asked for the previous year, but is a decrease from what Congress actually appropriated. This is something that Arun and I have talked about in great detail and actually wrote an article about in terms of the tension that you see and perhaps Congress trying to give the department a nudge to not just continue to carry along an RDT&E budget that is a pretty consistent subset of the overall budget, but to really, really move forward in modernization efforts. The second point that I would make is if you look at 6.4, 6.5, and 6.7, then this is where you see the real increase from fiscal year 22 to fiscal year 23. And in fact, if you look at the yellow category right there in the middle, that's the 6.5 budget category. That has the single greatest increase from both the FY22 requested as well as the FY22 enacted into the FY23 requested. What this comprises and this increase is driven by in that 6.5 budget category is really nuclear modernization, space-based missile warning systems, and the stand-in attack weapon, all of which are critical aspects of important defense programs. They are also not the kind of early stage S&T or R in R&D that many people think of when we talk about historically large RDT&E budgets and tremendous amount of effort and focus on the modernization of our overall defense portfolio. That is a deep dive into a wide range set of numbers. I'm going to pause there and I look forward to your questions. I will say there are a few risks that I think this picture overall raises, in addition to some great potential in terms of trends and activities and overall prioritization of critical technologies that I greatly hope continues to move forward. But most of all, I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found it insightful. I hope it becomes a resource for you because this is a really, really tough portfolio to break down into detail. And I look forward to your questions. So thank you so much for your attention, and Arun, back over to you.
So Tara, thank you very much for that presentation. I really loved it, but I am a budget wonk from Capitol Hill, but I'm sure other people loved it as much as I did. I have more questions here than we have time. So I will just try to fight my way through as many of these as I can and lump them together as best as I can. So one topic that's all the rage right now in the news is inflation. We're facing a very different inflationary environment today than we have for the last 20-something years or more. So one technical question, those charts and numbers you showed, are they all adjusted for inflation in the year that the column represents?
They would be done consistent with the way that the original data sources are presented. So we haven't done any inflation adjustments above and beyond what was represented in the contracts themselves or in the budget analysis. For example, or to be more specific, we aren't taking a subset of contracts and saying here's a conversion to today's dollar in terms of that value.
So then looking forward and looking at the budget request that's being considered on the Hill right now and the budget projections that we see in the Pentagon numbers, how should the companies and members of NDIA be thinking about the effect of inflation on all of this?
Yes, very thoughtful question. And it's a remarkable time to be thinking about and considering and weighing the implications of something that has reached a level higher than it's ever been in my entire lifetime. And so everyone, I think, needs to, whether you're thinking about business implications, you're thinking about the future of these critical defense capabilities, it really is an important topic. I also think, although Arun, I'd be curious for your take, it's got to be driving a lot of the debate on the Hill. You know, one of the major critiques of the FY23 President's Budget Request was that it simply didn't take enough of inflation into account, or rather, it didn't take the overall trend that we've seen so far in terms of this year, how steep inflation has been, as well as what most economists say is unlikely to change, at least dramatically, over the coming time period into account. Therefore, we might see increases above that top line budget request that don't actually turn into real material increases at all if you're thinking about it from the perspective of a business who's doing work with the federal government.
Right. I think you're pointing out that the Hill will have to deal with responding to constituents, particularly in industry, who will note those kinds of things, that even though the budget says this and the contract says that, cost of everything has gone up. And so someone needs to either be okay that we deliver less, or maybe provide more resources up front to deliver what you were expecting. The other big change from a DoD perspective is energy costs, which are in wild fluctuation now, and the pressure on those kinds of costs, which are often more must-pay bills for the Pentagon. It becomes very easy for the Pentagon, and you and I talked about this a little bit in the paper, it becomes very easy to reach back and steal from the R&D, the investment accounts, in order to get yourself fueled up as you need. So let me move on to another one there. Do you see trends in the time period we were looking at here with respect to basic versus applied versus value of debt spending versus procurement of advanced technologies? Is there anything notable that you're seeing in the last few years?
Yes, there's so much going on, actually. And I wish we had a follow-on session to do a deep dive just into those budget activities, because just looking at how the investment plan breaks down from 6.1 all the way through 6.8 within RDT&E alone tells you so much about where there is opportunity and where there's risk. So just particularly to jump in on the Valley of Death piece, you know, one thing that the Department of Defense loves to do is it loves a good peanut butter spread. And years ago, when we did not have huge increases in defense budgets and we were all focused on reform and we were focused on doing more with less, you know, we lamented the fact that the lack of data and the lack of visibility into spending meant that defense leaders had to just peanut butter spread that cut around. You took 5% off of everything to hit some target because you didn't really know where your money was going. We now see the exact same thing in spending money too, that we saw in saving it. So we say, well, we don't really know what we're getting for these modernization dollars. So let's go ahead and spread it around a whole bunch of different critical technologies. And while that's great for getting companies in the door at the SBIR level, at the early prototype level, at seeding a small business to even conceive of the idea of DoD as a potential client, it's wildly insufficient to turn those companies into publicly traded businesses or big movers in the American economy without picking winners. And so we've got to move away from the peanut butter spread approach to include placing bets, making some big investments, saying this is the investment thesis we have in these areas, and we're going to drive funding there accordingly to a point where we start to see the spending match those budget plans, hopefully over as short a time period as possible.
So that's great. So that I have a forward-looking question and a backward-looking question, but I'll start with the backward-looking question based on where you just were. So when you're a policymaker or a budget maker, then this notion that you should have a portfolio approach and place some high-risk bets on and some lower risk bets, and then make sure you keep your roof from leaking, but also invest in the future, all of those balancing things that you have to do. How can you look at the data and give the Pentagon some advice on return on investment on previous spending, particularly if I'm trying to figure out what's the appropriate balance between contracting with big companies versus small companies, traditional defense companies versus newer companies, even universities or internal government labs. Is there data you think that could help advise policy budget makers on those kinds of questions?
Absolutely, there is. And the place to start would be to get entities within DoD sharing their own data with each other. So for example, there are more than 40 different entities within the Department of Defense alone that are some variation of a technology accelerator or incubator. They all have their own stovepipes of data, which means they're out there talking to innovative American startups, they're running pitch days, they're reading SBIR applications, and right next door or across the river or up the highway is yet the next DoD works doing the exact same thing with the exact same companies. And by not sharing that information and more importantly, then putting it in the context of all of DoD's other activities, they keep running the same experiment over and over. So yes, there's a way to get at return on investment. That would be an easy place to start. At some point, DoD needs to get to a point where they're able to combine data coming out of wargaming, simulation, and modeling to look at impact of capability by the dollar. But that's a little bit of a higher lift, although I think some people are working on that too.
So then for the forward-looking question, both from the think tanker's perspective of just opining on the goods and bads of the budgets, and from the more practical business development perspective of the NDIA membership, what's your advice on the best way to look at projected budgets? How much should I live and die from what I understand from press reporting about a budget request? Or where is the best time and best way for me to invest my own company resources in thinking about these numbers?
Oh, all right. Well, I've been both a think tanker and a CEO, so I suppose I can't dodge that question, but it's a good one. I think that the overall way to look at trends, well, first of all, we can't look at trends until the administration gives us a fit up. So let's all try and get a national defense strategy and try and get our hands on a fit up. Once we have that, the question that I would dig into from think tank land is, where are we deviating from the peanut butter spread? Because what that tells me is, in terms of what the future outlook is, what capabilities DoD is going to get far enough along that future administrations or program offices can't wildly deviate from. That's going to be the future. These things get into the budget and they get baked. And no matter how wildly different administrations or teams might be, sometimes no matter how wildly the operating environment might be, a lot of things in DoD stay on track. From a business perspective, there's some truth to that too. But I don't think that you should look as far out as the think tankers do. And that's because a budget does not equal a total addressable market analysis. And so it's really, my advice there is key in on the place where you see technologies really driving change on the battlefield, because being able from our side of the world, on the industry side of the house, anything we can do to deliver value and to make anything in life better for the warfighter, that's going to drive business success.
Okay, I'm going to do one last question. It's if you were budget czar queen for the day, which piece of data would you wish more people had access to? What kind of data? And who would you share that with? Balancing all of the things that we always have to balance in security and proprietary. So what's your data wish?
My data wish is that all the budget czars, all the people who care about the numbers, we used to joke how many people, could you fit everybody who touches the POM process into the Pentagon parking lot? I think the understood answer was always no, that all of them would actually care about spending as well. Because, like I said, that view of well, what happens in terms of what actually goes out the door? That needs to be part of the calculation of whether we're on the right track as we continue to plan. But that isn't how DoD operates. And in terms of who I would share it with, and maybe I ought to take my own advice, I'd like to walk it right into CAPE and start there.
That's great. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation today. Thanks to all the members for your attendance and the great questions. We're going to post the recording on NDIA Connect as soon as possible. If you have feedback about this series or any of the NDIA ETI content, please email us at eti@ndia.org. We're looking for feedback on our events and our webinars, other topics you'd like us to cover, other good speakers. I also want to take the opportunity to highlight some upcoming events in our Tech 101 series, which is a sort of a series of dives into technology, not too deep, and intended for a lay audience. Blockchain 101 is coming up on July 21st, and you can see on the slide the other ones that are coming up in the fall. Registration information is on our website, and or feel free again to reach out to the ETI staff and we can get you hooked up with that. So again, one more time, thank you, Tara, and thank you for all the attendees. And with that, I'll close the session. Thanks very much.